It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to camp alone for the first time. I was 27 then, living in southern Illinois, and things in my life were starting to fall apart. Work, relationships, all of it. I wanted to clear my head, and I thought being out in the quiet would help. I'd done camping before with friends, but never completely alone. That's what made this one different. I picked a spot near the Shawnee National Forest, close to a slow, winding river that cut through the woods. It wasn't a campground, not one with signs or other people, just a rough dirt path that led down to a clearing beside the river. I found it on a map a few days earlier. I got there late in the afternoon, maybe around 5. The sun was still up but already softening, the kind of orange light that made everything look calm. The clearing was flat, surrounded by tall sycamore trees, their bark peeling off in long strips. The river was slow and quiet, with bits of fallen branches floating by. It looked perfect, quiet, isolated, and far from anyone. I set up my tent facing the river, with my car parked about 20 yards back up the dirt path. I had a small folding chair, a cooler, a single burner stove, and a flashlight. Everything was packed neat the way I always liked it. After setting up, I walked down to the water to wash my hands and felt how cool it was, the kind of chill that came from depth. You could tell the river ran deep there. I remember thinking how nice it was to finally hear nothing. No cars, no people, no constant noise, just the hum of insects and the distant rustling of leaves. When it started getting darker, I made a small fire. I cooked a can of chili and sat beside the flames watching the sky fade. The woods across the river turned black before mine did. I sat for a long time, just staring at the reflection of the moon on the water, the faint ripples breaking it apart. I remember thinking how easy it would be to forget the rest of the world existed out here. I must have gone to bed around 10, crawling into my tent with the flashlight still in my hand. First, it was peaceful. The air was cool. The fire outside had burned down to red coals, and the sound of the river was steady, almost like breathing. I lay there staring at the top of the tent for a long time before falling asleep. I woke up sometime during the night, not sure what time, but the woods were completely dark. No moon, no stars, just thick black. I woke up because I heard something. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. The sound of footsteps on the gravelly dirt near the river. Not fast, just slow and uneven. I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, but it sounded heavier, like boots pressing into the dirt. Then there was another sound, a scrape, like metal brushing against rock. I stayed still, barely breathing. The tent was zipped, and the flashlight was right beside me, but I didn't turn it on. I just listened. The steps went on for a while, maybe a minute or so, moving closer, then stopping completely. Then silence again. I waited, listening so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears. Nothing else came. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just an animal and managed to fall back asleep. When I woke again, it was early morning. The air was damp, and the sky was pale gray. I stepped out of the tent and walked to the river to splash my face with water. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't animal prints. They were boot marks, fresh and deep in the damp soil near the riverbank. They led right up to where I was standing and then turned toward the trees across the clearing. I followed them with my eyes, but they disappeared into the woods. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen or heard another car the whole drive in, and the dirt path to this spot was narrow and rough. There was no reason for anyone else to be here. I looked across the river, half expecting to see someone watching, but there was nothing, just trees and mist. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was a fisherman or a hiker who'd wandered through. I made breakfast, packed some of my stuff, and told myself I'd stay one more night and leave early the next morning. But I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. That afternoon, I went exploring up the dirt road past where my car was parked. The forest was quiet, but not peaceful anymore. Every sound made me turn around. Branches cracking, birds suddenly taking off. I walked maybe half a mile before finding another clearing, smaller, with what looked like an old fire pit and a torn blue tarp hanging from a tree. It looked like someone had been living there, but not recently. The tarp was sun-faded and torn, and there were rusted cans on the ground. I remember thinking someone had squatted there months ago. I stayed only a minute before heading back to my camp. The sun was going down when I got back. I rebuilt the fire, cooked again, and sat quietly watching the woods. I didn't feel comfortable anymore. The river that looked peaceful yesterday now looked dark and deep. Even the air felt heavier. I decided to keep the fire burning through the night, hoping the light would keep away any animals or people. I got into the tent around 11. I zipped it up and lay there listening. Took a while to drift off. Sometime after midnight, I woke again, same as before. Only this time I knew it wasn't an animal. The footsteps were back, moving slowly around the edge of the clearing. I could hear the dirt shifting under boots. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would shake the tent. The sound came closer, stopping just a few feet from where I was lying. Then I heard breathing. Slow, uneven breathing, like someone trying to stay quiet but not doing a good job of it. My hand was gripping the flashlight, but I couldn't move. The breathing went on for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. After that, there was silence again, long enough for me to think whoever it was had gone. Then I heard the faint sound of something metallic clinking, like a knife or tool brushing against a belt. That was enough. I unzipped the tent as slowly as I could, grabbed the flashlight and my car keys, and ran straight for the car. The beam from the light shook wildly over the ground, and for a second, I saw movement at the edge of the trees. Just a shadow, but tall, human. I didn't stop. I jumped in the car, locked the doors, and started it. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the keys twice before getting the engine on. The headlights swept across the clearing, and for a split second, I saw him. A man standing at the edge of the woods. He was wearing dark clothes, maybe a jacket, and something was in his hand. He wasn't moving, just standing and watching. His face was in shadow. I slammed the car into gear and drove out of there as fast as I could, tires throwing dirt and gravel behind me. I didn't stop until I hit the main road miles away. I pulled over once I reached the highway and sat there, breathing hard, trying to calm down. I stayed in a motel that night, too afraid to even close my eyes. The next morning, I went back with a park ranger. I told him what happened, and he didn't say much, just nodded and followed me down the dirt path. When we got to the clearing, the fire was cold, my tent still there, and everything untouched except for one thing. There were fresh footprints in the mud, right where I'd parked my car, facing the tent. The ranger said it could have been someone passing through, maybe a hunter or a drifter, but I could tell he didn't believe that either. He told me people sometimes lived off-grid in the forest, and some didn't like being found. I packed everything fast and left. I never went camping alone again after that. Even now, when I think about it, the thing that gets me the most isn't the man himself. It's knowing that he had to have been there that first night too, standing just close enough to watch me sleep, waiting in the dark, probably deciding what to do next. Sometimes, when I hear slow footsteps outside my window at night, I still wonder if he followed me back that morning. I went camping alone in the south of France in the summer of 2017. I had just turned 26 and wanted to spend a week away from people, away from the noise of the city. I was traveling through Europe at the time, and France had always felt safe to me. Quiet roads, kind people, beautiful countryside. I had no reason to expect anything strange or dangerous. I chose a small riverside camping spot near a place called Saint-Antonin-Noble-Val, deep in the countryside. It wasn't an official campsite, more like a clearing surrounded by trees. maybe an hour's walk from the nearest small road. I liked places like that, far from everything. The first day went well. I set up my tent near the river, cooked some pasta on my small gas stove, and spent the afternoon swimming and reading. The river was cold and clean. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. When it got dark, I sat by the small fire I made and listened to the insects and the water. There was nothing else. No cars, no people, just the quiet sounds of the forest. I fell asleep easily that night, tired but relaxed. The next morning, I woke up early, made some instant coffee, and started walking up the riverbank with my camera. I like taking photos of old trees and rock formations. Around noon, I noticed an old wooden footbridge a little farther up the river. It looked half broken, with missing planks and rope railing that sagged under its own weight. Across the bridge, there was an open grassy area, maybe an old path or an abandoned camping ground. I walked around for a bit, found a few burnt pieces of wood where people must have made fires before, and some empty beer bottles probably left by locals. While I was walking back toward my tent, I saw someone across the river. He was standing near the trees, wearing a dark jacket even though it was warm. I thought maybe it was another camper or a fisherman. I waved once, but he didn't move. He just stood there, half hidden in the shade, facing my direction. I couldn't see his face clearly from that distance. Something about him felt off, but I told myself it was nothing. People in the countryside can be quiet or strange sometimes. I went back to my tent and tried to ignore it. That evening, I started feeling uneasy. Every time I looked across the water, I thought I saw something. A shadow, a figure, a bit of movement. Could have been my imagination, or maybe the reflection of trees. But the feeling didn't leave. When the sun started going down, I added more wood to my fire and sat closer to it. The air felt colder than the night before. I didn't sleep well. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside the tent. It was faint at first, just the sound of leaves crunching slowly, like footsteps trying to be quiet. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The sound stopped for a few seconds, then started again, closer this time. My heart was pounding. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it at the tent wall. The light made the fabric glow pale white. For a second, I thought I saw a shadow moving just beyond it. I stayed perfectly still, not making a sound. Then, after maybe a minute, the noise stopped completely. I didn't dare go outside. I waited for what felt like hours until I finally fell asleep again from exhaustion. In the morning, I found fresh footprints near the edge of my tent, pressed into the dirt. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier. Someone had definitely been walking around during the night. My stomach sank. I looked around carefully, but there was no one. I told myself it could have been a hiker passing by, or someone curious, maybe drunk, wandering from the road. But the nearest road was far away, and no one would walk all that distance at night. I packed my things slowly that day, thinking about leaving, but I still had food and wanted to stay at least another night. By evening, I convinced myself I was overreacting. I moved my tent closer to the riverbank, thinking that the running water might drown out noises and help me sleep. I tried to act normal. I cooked, ate, and watched the fire until the sky turned black. Around 10 or 11, I saw a flicker of light across the river. It looked like a small flashlight moving between the trees. I froze. The light moved slowly, stopping now and then, like someone was scanning the ground or looking for something. I turned off my own flashlight and crouched by the fire. After a while, the light disappeared. I could still hear faint snapping of branches, though. Someone was definitely there. I waited a long time before going into the tent. Later that night, I woke up again. This time, I heard the sound of water splashing. It wasn't loud, but steady, like footsteps moving through the shallow part of the river. I lay still, barely breathing. The sound came closer, slow and deliberate. Then it stopped right near my tent. The only thing I could hear was the soft dripping of water. I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but I couldn't move. My chest felt tight. I just waited. After maybe a minute, the sound of footsteps started again, this time moving away, slow, crunching steps up the slope behind my tent. Then silence. When the sun came up, I went to look. There were wet footprints on the rocks by the river, leading straight toward my campsite. I followed them for a few meters until they disappeared into the dirt. I noticed something else, a half-burnt cigarette near the tree line. I didn't smoke. That meant he had stood there, watching, maybe while I slept. That was enough for me. I packed everything fast, barely eating breakfast. My hands were shaking. I took the path that led back to the small dirt road where my rental car was parked. The whole time I felt like someone was following me. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen, but there was nothing except birds and wind. Still, I walked faster. When I reached the car, I noticed a dark stain on the driver's side window, like someone had touched it with dirty hands. There were small streaks of mud down the door. I didn't look around. I just threw my backpack inside and started the engine. As I drove down the narrow country road, I kept checking the rearview mirror. The forest behind me looked still and empty. I drove until I reached a small town, maybe 30 minutes away, and parked outside a cafe. I sat there for a while, trying to calm down. I thought about going to the local police, but what would I even say? That someone might have watched me at night? That there were footprints? There was no proof of anything except that someone else had been in the area. Could have been a farmer, a hunter, anyone. Still, something deep inside me knew that man wasn't just passing through. He had been watching me deliberately. That night, I checked into a cheap motel and locked the door. I remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how different everything had felt just a few days earlier, how peaceful the forest had seemed. Now every sound made me jump. I realized how fragile that feeling of safety is when you're alone in the wild. A few days later, when I was back in Toulouse, I looked up that area online. There had been reports over the years of campers finding their things stolen, tents slashed, or waking up to find footprints around their campsites. No one had ever been caught. Some said it was a hermit living in the woods. Others thought it was someone mentally unstable who roamed the riverbanks. I never found out who it was, and I never went camping alone again. Even now, years later, when I hear water running at night, I still remember that slow sound of footsteps coming through the river, coming closer, stopping right outside my tent, like he was listening to my breathing in the dark. It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I was 23 then, working a boring warehouse job in northern Pennsylvania, and I had a few days off. I'd been scrolling through hiking forums one night and came across a post about an old abandoned quarry deep inside the Bald Eagle State Forest. The post mentioned how quiet it was there, how nobody really went that far in anymore since the old mining road had washed out years back. That sounded perfect to me. No people, no noise, just quiet. I packed my gear that Friday morning. Tent, sleeping bag, cheap propane stove, flashlight, a small hatchet, and enough food to last 3 nights. I even brought a small cooler with a few beers, thinking I'd reward myself after setting up camp. The drive took nearly 3 hours, mostly on cracked country roads that twisted through thick woods. By the time I reached the dirt turnoff that led toward the quarry, the sun was high and the air was heavy with that sticky midsummer heat. The road wasn't really a road anymore. It was 2 ruts filled with rocks, mud, and overgrown grass. I drove slowly, the branches scraping the sides of my old Ford Escape. After a mile or so, the trees opened into a clearing, flat ground surrounded by tall pines, the remains of an old gravel pit visible through the brush. I parked near what looked like the remains of a rusted bulldozer and shut off the engine. The silence hit immediately. No distant traffic, no voices, not even wind. Just the faint buzz of insects and the ticking of the cooling engine. I set up my tent at the edge of the clearing, close to the tree line. The ground was uneven, full of roots and rocks, but I managed to find a decent patch of dirt. After that, I went exploring. The quarry itself was a massive bowl of gray stone, overgrown with weeds and small trees that had forced their way through the cracks. A shallow pool of rainwater had collected at the bottom, covered with green algae. Old tire tracks were still faintly visible in the dirt. I found a rusted barrel, a few beer cans, and a crumpled sleeping bag half buried in the brush. It looked like someone had camped there a long time ago and just left everything behind. As the evening settled in, I made a small fire and cooked a can of beans. The woods were so quiet it almost didn't feel real. Every tiny sound stood out. The crack of burning wood, the buzz of a fly, the distant rustle of leaves. I drank 2 beers, watched the sky turn from orange to deep blue, and crawled into my tent once the mosquitoes got bad. I woke up around midnight. I didn't know why at first. I lay still, staring at the dim outline of the tent above me. Then I heard footsteps, not animal sounds, actual footsteps on dry leaves. Slow, steady, moving from somewhere beyond the trees. I held my breath. The steps came closer, then stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. After a long minute, there was nothing, just silence again. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. I turned on my side, pulling the sleeping bag over my head, and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I went to check around camp. I didn't see any tracks near the tent, but about 30 feet away, near the edge of the clearing, I found something odd. An old boot print, half filled with water. It looked fresh, too fresh for something that had been there before I arrived. The dirt around it was still soft. I stared at it for a while, then shrugged it off. Maybe I'd stepped there last night when setting up firewood. That day, I decided to hike deeper into the woods behind the quarry. There was an old trail that ran uphill, barely visible, and I followed it for maybe an hour. The forest got denser, darker. I found an old shack up there, just 4 walls of rotted wood and a collapsed roof. Inside were some rusted cans, a few beer bottles, and a dirty sleeping bag rolled up in the corner. It smelled like damp earth and something sour. I didn't stay long. When I got back to camp that afternoon, I noticed something else strange. My cooler had been moved. I always kept it beside the fire pit, but now it was behind the tent. Nothing was missing, but it was definitely not where I'd left it. The lid was slightly open, and there was a smudge of dirt across it, like someone had touched it with muddy hands. I started to feel uneasy then, a slow creeping worry in the back of my mind. I spent the rest of the evening closer to the fire, keeping the hatchet near me. The sun went down around 8, and I sat there, listening to the forest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't hear footsteps that night, but around 2 in the morning I woke up again to a different sound, a faint clicking. It sounded like someone tapping 2 rocks together. Came from somewhere past the tree line, rhythmic and slow. Top, top, top. It went on for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped. By morning, I was running low on firewood. I decided I'd pack up the next day and head home early. I spent most of that day trying to relax, reading a paperback I'd brought, drinking the last of the beers, and ignoring the uneasy feeling that had settled in. But just before dusk, as I was collecting a few sticks near the tree line, I noticed movement about 50 yards away. Someone was standing there. It took a second for my brain to register it. A man, tall, thin, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. He wasn't moving, just standing between the trees, facing my direction. I froze. My mouth went dry. He didn't say anything, didn't move closer, didn't even turn his head. I backed slowly toward my tent, never taking my eyes off him. Then, as quietly as he appeared, He turned and walked deeper into the woods until I couldn't see him anymore. That was enough. I packed my bag as fast as I could, leaving most of my firewood and half my gear. The sun was almost gone, but I didn't care. I threw everything into the car and started driving down that overgrown dirt road, branches snapping against the sides. My hands were shaking the whole way. About a quarter mile from camp, I saw something again. In the rearview mirror, through the dust and fading light, there was a figure standing in the road behind me. Same man, same clothes, just standing there, facing me as I drove away. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. When I reached the paved highway, I pulled over and sat there for a while, trying to calm down. My shirt was soaked in sweat, and my pulse was still hammering. I checked my phone, no signal, of course. I drove until I found a small gas station near Mifflinburg, parked by the pumps, and just sat there until I felt steady enough to drive home. That night, after I finally made it back to my apartment, I emptied my backpack and noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the bottom of the bag was a small folded piece of paper, dirty and creased. I didn't remember packing it. I opened it slowly. Inside, written in smudged pencil, were two words, "Nice place." My hands went cold. I dropped the paper on the floor and just stared at it. I don't know when it was put there. I never left my backpack unzipped, not once. The thought of that man, or whoever it was, standing near my tent while I slept made me feel sick. I never reported it. I didn't even tell anyone for a long time. It sounded too strange, too hard to explain without sounding paranoid. But I haven't gone camping since. Even now, years later, sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear that faint tapping sound again, somewhere out there in the dark. And every time I do, I remember that quiet quarry, that stillness in the woods, and how I wasn't really alone out there. It was late October 2018 when I decided to take a short solo camping trip out near an old abandoned campground deep in northern Oregon. I had just turned 31 and needed a quiet weekend away from everything. I'd been to plenty of state parks before, but this time I wanted something more remote, somewhere forgotten. A coworker once mentioned an old site near the foothills of the Wallowas that had been shut down in the late 80s after a few incidents involving wild animals. It was never officially reopened, but he said there were still fire pits and flat ground for tents. That sounded perfect to me. Quiet, empty, and cheap. I packed light. A small two-person tent, sleeping bag, hatchet, folding knife, a camping stove, a few cans of food, and a single gas lantern. I left my phone in the car most of the time when I camped because I liked the idea of being disconnected. The drive took about 4 hours from where I lived. By the time I turned off the main road, the pavement had given way to uneven dirt and gravel. Tall pine trees crowded both sides of the trail, and the sound of my tires crunching over the stones echoed through the forest. The farther I went, the quieter it got. Just the faint hum of my truck and the occasional snap of branches. The trail ended in a wide, overgrown clearing. A half-rotted wooden sign still stood near the edge, tilted sideways with faded letters that read something like Hill Pine Campground. The area looked untouched for decades. Nature had taken over. Weeds climbed up through old picnic tables, and a rusted water pump leaned sideways beside a collapsed fire ring. I parked my truck near what used to be a parking area and walked around to scout the place. The air felt heavy, damp with the smell of moss and pine. It was the kind of stillness that made even the smallest sound sharp. I could hear a distant creak somewhere downhill, maybe 100 yards away. I picked a spot near the center of the clearing, flat ground, a ring of stones, and an old half-burned log I could sit on. It took me about an hour to set up camp. The tent went up easily, and I laid out my sleeping bag and a small mat inside. I gathered some wood from the surrounding area and started a small fire before the sun dipped too low. The flames caught fast, and the warmth spread through the air, cutting the evening chill. I cooked a can of chili on my stove and ate slowly, just listening. The forest was full of faint noises, rustling leaves, a woodpecker somewhere in the distance, the occasional creak of trees swaying. As night came on, the place felt even more remote. My fire was the only light in any direction. The tree line seemed darker than usual, and every so often, I think I heard something moving beyond it. A crunch of dry twigs, a soft shifting sound. I tried to brush it off as animals. Deer, maybe. The forest was full of them. Around 10, I decided to call it a night. I let the fire die down to glowing embers and went into the tent. I could hear the faint trickle of the creek nearby and the wind whispering through the trees. It wasn't peaceful exactly. More like the forest was alive in a way that made me too aware of every noise. I eventually drifted off. I woke up suddenly a few hours later. It was dead quiet. Not the kind of quiet where things are calm, but that unnatural silence where it feels like everything is holding its breath. My first thought was that something was near the tent. I lay still, barely breathing, and listened. There was a faint sound, slow steps on leaves, not heavy, but deliberate. They circled around one side of the tent. I could hear the dry leaves shifting under whatever it was. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was probably a deer again, maybe sniffing around for food, but the steps were too careful, too quiet. I didn't move. The sound stopped right outside the tent door. I waited, my heart thudding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then I heard a faint scrape, like something brushing against the nylon. Just one quick drag, then silence again. I reached slowly for the hatchet I'd kept next to my sleeping bag. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely grip the handle. I lay there for what felt like an hour, but it was probably only minutes. Nothing else happened. No more sounds. Eventually, I convinced myself it was an animal and that it had wandered off. When the first bit of light hit the tent, I got out right away. The air was cold and misty, my breath showing in white puffs. I looked around the site. The leaves were disturbed near one side of the tent, and I could see a faint trail leading toward the tree line. It looked like footprints, bare ones. The ground was too soft to tell details, but they weren't shaped like boots. They were human. I tried to think rationally. Maybe a hiker had come through, or some local person cutting through the woods. But who walks barefoot through a freezing forest at night? I told myself it didn't matter. I was leaving that afternoon anyway. I just needed to get through the morning. I cooked a small breakfast, but I barely touched it. The woods felt different now, like I was being watched. I could swear I saw movement between the trees every so often, just flashes of something pale. Around mid-morning, I decided to take a short walk down to the creek to calm myself. The trail was narrow and overgrown. The water was clearer than I expected, running over smooth stones. I knelt down and splashed some on my face. When I stood up again, I noticed something upstream. A piece of fabric caught on a branch. I walked over and saw it was an old, sun-faded blue shirt, torn and stiff like it had been there for years. There were dark stains on it that looked brownish red. I didn't touch it. I turned and went straight back to camp. By the time I got back, the fire was cold, and the wind had picked up. The trees were swaying harder now, creaking as they moved. That uneasy feeling was back, heavier this time. I packed my stuff fast, barely folding the tent before throwing it in the truck bed. As I was closing the tailgate, I heard it again, the same soft crunch of footsteps from behind me. I froze. They were coming from the far side of the clearing, slow and steady. I turned, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but the sound was still there, closer now. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt the presence of something just out of sight. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the truck, and threw it in reverse. The tires spun on the damp dirt for a second before catching. I backed out fast, not even bothering to look around the campsite again. The road back to the main highway felt endless. The forest seemed to close in around me, the narrow path lined with leaning trees and fallen branches. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, and my eyes flicked between the mirrors and the road ahead. A few times I thought I saw someone in the distance along the trail, just the outline of a figure standing among the trees, but every time I blinked, it was gone. When I finally hit the paved road again, I pulled over and sat there for a long time, trying to steady myself. My chest felt tight and my mouth was dry. I told myself it was just paranoia, that my mind had played tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been alone out there. A few weeks later, I looked up the name of the campground again. Hillpine. There wasn't much about it online, just a few old mentions in local records. It had been closed in 1987 after several disappearances were reported in the surrounding area. Hikers, campers, even a park worker. They were never found. The site was officially marked as unsafe because of wildlife and terrain hazards. But there were rumors of an old trapper who used to live in those woods, a man who refused to leave even after it was shut down. I don't know if that was true, and I don't really care to find out. I haven't gone camping alone since. My gear still sits in my garage, untouched, covered in dust. Sometimes at night, when it's quiet, I still think about those footsteps circling my tent. The slow, steady sound of someone, or something, walking barefoot in the dark. That's the thing about places that get left behind. They're not really empty. Something always fills the space. Nature, time, or whatever's left of the people who never made it out. It was late October 2017 when I decided to go camping alone in the thick forests of northern Wyoming. I was 27 back then, working long shifts in a small mechanic shop, and I needed a break from the noise, the engines, the people, everything. I'd been camping since I was a kid, so it didn't bother me being out there by myself. I packed my tent, a small gas stove, a hunting knife, a lantern, a sleeping bag, and enough food for 3 days. I drove my old silver Ford Ranger up into the Bighorn Mountains, parked it off a small dirt trail, and hiked about 2 miles into the woods before setting up camp near a small stream. It was quiet, cold, and perfect. The first day went smooth. I spent the afternoon fishing by the stream and managed to catch 2 small trout, which I cooked over the fire when the sun went down. The air was crisp, the sky was clear, and the sound of running water mixed with the crackle of burning wood. It was peaceful, the kind of peace you only get far from anything man-made. When it got colder, I zipped myself into the sleeping bag and drifted off listening to the faint rustling of the trees. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps. They were faint at first, distant, soft crunches of dry leaves. I figured it was probably a deer or a coyote, so I stayed still and listened. After a few seconds, I heard them again, slow, uneven steps, moving around the edge of my camp. They didn't sound like animal movements, though. It was too heavy. I could almost feel the ground shift under each step. My heart started beating faster, and I reached quietly for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. The footsteps stopped for a few seconds, and then I heard what sounded like a slow drag, like someone sliding their boot through the dirt. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. After what felt like a minute or two, the noise faded away, and I eventually managed to fall back asleep, though it wasn't a deep sleep at all. When the sun came up, everything looked normal. I checked around the camp and found a few faint boot prints in the dirt near the stream. They weren't mine. They were larger, wider, and looked old, but it was hard to tell exactly how old. I told myself maybe a hunter had passed through early in the morning or maybe sometime yesterday before I arrived. That made sense enough for me to shake it off and continue my day. I spent the next few hours hiking through the trees, just exploring and taking photos. Around noon, I climbed up a small ridge to get a better view of the valley below. It was quiet except for the wind and the occasional bird call. No sign of anyone. Later that evening, I made another fire and cooked some canned beans. The light started fading fast, and I remember how the forest seemed to swallow sound as night fell. I could hear my heartbeat more than anything else. Around 9 p.m., I was sitting near the fire sharpening my knife when I heard it again. Footsteps. Same slow, steady rhythm. I turned off my lantern and crouched, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. The fire was still glowing faintly, throwing out weak light, and in that half-light, I saw something. A figure, tall and still, standing about 20 yards away near the edge of the trees. I couldn't make out details, but I knew it wasn't an animal. It was standing upright, just watching. I froze. My mind ran through every possible explanation. A lost hiker, a hunter, someone from a nearby camp maybe. But the area was completely remote. I hadn't seen a single soul since I got there. After what felt like a full minute, the figure slowly turned and disappeared behind the trees. I didn't hear running or snapping branches, just silence. That silence was worse than the footsteps. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going and my knife within reach, sitting in the tent with the lantern dimmed low. Every time the wind moved the branches, I flinched. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard the faint crunch of leaves again, this time circling the camp. My skin crawled. The noises stopped, then started again on the other side. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be pacing, keeping distance but staying near. The sound stopped completely when the first faint light of dawn came through. When morning finally came, I packed most of my stuff and decided I'd head back to the truck that day. I was tired, wired from the night before, and I didn't want to stick around another night. Before leaving, I walked to where I thought I'd seen the figure. There were faint boot prints again, deep enough to be recent. They led away from camp and then vanished into the undergrowth. I started hiking back toward my truck around mid-morning. The woods felt different now. Even though it was daylight, I felt watched. Every sound felt too close. At one point, I stopped for a drink of water and noticed something strange. A torn piece of dark fabric hanging on a branch near the trail. It looked like part of a jacket sleeve, ripped clean off. It was fresh too, not weathered. That made me move faster. About halfway back, I heard something moving behind me. I turned quick, knife in hand, but saw nothing, just trees. I stood still, listening. Then I caught it again, that dragging sound, like a boot scraping dirt. I didn't wait this time. I started walking fast, not running but close to it, trying not to make noise. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The sound followed me for a bit, always at the same distance, always keeping pace. When I finally reached the truck, it was still there, but something was off. There were fresh muddy prints on the driver's side door. Handprints, large ones, smeared like someone had been leaning against it or trying to open it. My stomach dropped. I scanned the tree line, but everything was still. I unlocked the door, tossed my pack inside, and got in fast. The moment I started the engine, I saw movement in my side mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the road maybe 50 yards behind me, half hidden by the trees. He wasn't moving, just standing there. The sunlight hit just enough for me to see the outline of a man in a dark jacket, maybe wearing a hood. I didn't stick around to find out. I floored it down that dirt road, kicking up gravel and dust. I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors. When I got back to town, I stopped at a gas station to wash my face and grab something to drink. My hands were still shaking. There was a bit of dried mud on the side of the truck near the handle, exactly where those prints had been. I looked closer. The prints were large, wide-fingered, and had faint scratches through the mud, almost like whoever made them had torn skin or dirty nails. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that figure standing near my camp, the same shape in the trees when I drove off. The part that bothered me most wasn't just being watched. It was realizing how close that person must have been while I was asleep in the tent. Those boot prints circled my camp. Whoever it was had walked around me in the dark, maybe more than once. A week later, I went online to check if there had been any reports of people going missing or any weird activity in that area. There wasn't much, just a few scattered mentions of hikers finding old campsites with supplies still there, as if someone had left in a hurry. That was enough for me. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still remember the sound of those footsteps. Slow, careful, patient. And sometimes, when I drive through the mountains now, I catch myself checking the tree line, half expecting to see that same figure standing there, waiting like he never left those woods at all. It was late October 2017, somewhere deep in northern Wyoming, a few miles past the Bighorn National Forest boundary line. I had gone hunting alone that year, which wasn't unusual for me. I was 33 then, used to being out there for days at a time. I liked the quiet, the cold air, the way the woods felt when you were the only human for miles. I'd hunted in that region before, but that particular trip stuck with me, burned into my head in a way that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. I parked my truck near an old logging road that hadn't been used in years. The trees had grown thick around it, and the path was rough with mud and roots. The plan was simple: hike a few miles in, set up camp near a ridge I'd scouted on Google Earth, and spend the next couple of days tracking elk. I had my .308 rifle, my pack with a small tent, a sleeping bag, and enough food and water for 3 days. The air was thin, cold enough that my breath hung in front of me like smoke. The smell of pine was everywhere, sharp and clean. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was already sinking behind the tree line. I set up camp just off a narrow clearing where I could see down into a small valley. The grass there was high and yellow, waving softly in the wind. It looked peaceful, untouched. I remember thinking I'd chosen the perfect spot. I built a small fire, cooked a can of beans, and ate while the light faded to gray. When the fire died down, I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and listened to the woods. It was the usual night sounds at first, the crack of branches, distant owls, maybe a coyote far off. But sometime past midnight, I woke up to a noise that didn't fit. It wasn't loud, just wrong. It was the sound of slow, careful steps moving through the leaves, too heavy to be a raccoon or fox. I lay still, eyes open, heartbeat thudding in my ears. The steps stopped near my tent, so close I could hear the soft crunch of dirt shifting. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing. After what felt like minutes, the sound started again, moving away this time. I didn't sleep after that. I kept my hand on my rifle, listening until the first light came through the tent fabric. When morning finally broke, I stepped outside. The air was cold and damp, fog rolling through the trees. I walked around my tent, scanning the ground. There were prints, not boot prints, but bare feet. Human feet, adult-sized. The toes were spread wide, and the dirt around them was dark, pressed deep, like whoever it was had been standing there for a while, just watching. I told myself it was some drifter or hiker. People wandered out here sometimes, but it didn't sit right with me. I decided to move camp deeper into the woods that morning, closer to the ridgeline where there was less chance of anyone stumbling onto me. The hike took a couple hours. I followed an old game trail through thick pines and crossed a shallow creek where the mud sucked at my boots. The further I went, the quieter everything got. Even the birds seemed to stop. I found another clearing, smaller this time, set my tent back up, and took off to scout. I spent most of that day tracking signs of elk. Found some droppings, some fresh tracks near the edge of the valley, but nothing close enough to take a shot. Around late afternoon, I circled back toward camp, following the same path I'd taken that morning. When I got there, something felt wrong immediately. My tent was still standing, but the flap was open. My gear was scattered. My food bag was torn open, cans rolled into the dirt. My sleeping bag had been dragged halfway out. There were more of those same barefoot prints around the camp. Dozens of them this time, circling. My heart sank when I realized they weren't leading away in any direction. They just stopped like whoever it was had been standing there again. For hours. Irepachiet fast. Every sound in the woods made me twitch. I didn't want to camp there another night, but the sun was already low, and the terrain was steep ahead. The last thing I wanted was to get lost in the dark. I built a small fire again, but I didn't eat much. I kept my rifle across my lap and stayed awake long into the night. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the side of the tent. It was slow, dragging like fingers across the fabric. I sat up instantly, hand gripping the rifle. The noise stopped, then came again, this time on the other side. Then silence. I unzipped the tent just a few inches and peeked out. The fire had burned down to a pile of glowing embers. I couldn't see much, just outlines of trees against the sky. Then, out near the edge of the clearing, I saw movement. A dark shape, tall, standing between the trees. It was too far to make out any detail, but it wasn't an animal. It was a person. They weren't moving. They were just there, watching. I froze. Every instinct in me screamed to yell, to do something, but I stayed quiet. I watched that figure for what must have been half an hour. They didn't move once. Then, slowly, they stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I didn't sleep again. When daylight came, I packed everything and left. I didn't even cook breakfast. I just slung my pack on and started hiking back toward the truck, sticking to the ridgeline where the forest opened enough to see ahead. Took most of the day to get back to where I'd parked. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and my nerves were shot. When I finally saw the road, I felt this huge wave of relief until I noticed something sitting on the hood of my truck. It was my food bag, the same one that had been torn open back at camp. It was folded neatly, like someone had placed it there carefully. I stopped in my tracks. The dirt around the truck was covered in more of those same barefoot prints, circling, crisscrossing, leading back into the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring, listening. The woods were silent again. No wind, no birds. I climbed into the truck, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the key. I drove for miles before I stopped at a gas station in a small town near Buffalo. When I looked at the truck, I noticed muddy smears along the side of the door, like someone had dragged their hands down the paint. I told the clerk it was just mud from the road, paid for gas, and left. I never reported it. I didn't know what I'd even say. There was no crime, nothing stolen, no proof, just those footprints burned into my memory. I haven't been back hunting alone since then. I still go sometimes, but always with someone else. I don't tell them why. I don't tell anyone. Every now and then, I'll wake up in the middle of the night and think about that trip. The prints, the figure, the bag on the hood, the way it all felt. Not supernatural, not like a story people make up, but real, heavy, human. Whoever was out there wasn't lost. They knew exactly what they were doing. They watched me for 2 nights straight. They wanted me to know they were there. And the worst part, the thing that keeps me awake sometimes, is that they didn't follow me out. They didn't chase me or attack me. They let me leave, which means somewhere right now they might still be out there, waiting for the next person who decides to camp alone. It was late October 2019. I had been driving across northern Arizona for a photography project. stopping at small towns and abandoned places, taking pictures of whatever caught my attention. I wasn't the kind of person who usually camped alone, but that trip was different. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be somewhere without people, without noise. So when I found a dirt road cutting through the red mesas and scrub-covered hills just west of Tuba City, I took it. The road was rough, but after about 20 minutes of bouncing over rocks and dry washes, I found a flat area near a line of low cliffs that looked perfect for camping. The place was silent, completely still except for the wind moving through the dry grass. I pitched my tent near a cluster of large boulders and watched the sun drop behind the horizon. The colors stretched across the sky in streaks of deep red and purple, fading into a pale gray that swallowed everything around me. By the time I got the fire going, night had already settled heavy over the desert. There was no cell service, no glow of towns in the distance, just the dark and the constant whistle of the wind. I ate a can of chili, threw the empty tin in my truck bed, and sat there by the fire for a while. The heat felt good against the cold air. The fire cracked and spat sparks into the dark. It was quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. It felt like the kind that comes when something is watching. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just tired, but the feeling stayed, pressing at the back of my neck like someone standing behind me. I walked around my camp a few times with my flashlight, shining it across the rocks and into the dry brush. There was nothing, not even animal sounds. That was what really got me. No crickets, no owls, nothing moving. The desert should have been alive at night, but it was dead silent. I went into my tent around 11, zipped it up, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The wind kept pushing against the tent walls, making them rustle. I drifted in and out of sleep until I heard something strange. Footsteps. Not the soft steps of a small animal, but slow, uneven crunches, like someone walking carefully through gravel. I froze. The sound came from somewhere behind my truck, maybe 30 feet away. I didn't move. I just listened. The footsteps would come a few paces closer, then stop. The silence after each step felt heavier. I thought maybe it was a coyote, maybe even a deer, but then I heard something else. A breath, slow and steady, human. I reached for the small flashlight beside my sleeping bag and clicked it on. The thin beam of light cut through the tent fabric. The moment I turned it on, the sound outside stopped completely. I waited for what felt like minutes, my ears ringing from the silence. Then, just as I started to think I'd imagined it, I heard something brush lightly against the tent wall, a slow drag like a hand sliding down the fabric. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might shake the tent. I unzipped the bag slowly and sat up, trying not to make noise. The air smelled like dirt and smoke from the dead fire. I wanted to open the tent and shine the light outside, but something deep in my gut told me not to. I just sat there, holding the flashlight, barely breathing. The dragging sound moved around the tent. First the left side, then the back, then the front. Then it stopped again. After a long stretch of silence, I heard something farther away, like soft footsteps moving off into the dark. I waited. Then I unzipped the tent a few inches and pointed the flashlight through the opening. The beam hit the rocks, the grass, the outline of my truck, and then, about 20 yards away, something moved. It ducked behind a boulder fast, too fast for me to see what it was. But I caught a glimpse of something tall and thin, the shape of a person, maybe. I shut off the light and sat there in the dark. My mind was racing. If it was a person, what were they doing out there? There weren't any houses or roads nearby. I hadn't seen a single car all day. It didn't make sense. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the image of that shape moving. I stayed awake the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, waiting for something else to happen. Around 3 in the morning, I started hearing faint noises again. Small rocks shifting, dry grass crunching, as if something was circling the camp from a distance. I never saw anything again, but I could feel it out there, keeping its distance but never leaving. When dawn finally came, I stepped out of the tent, exhausted. The fire pit was cold, my truck covered in a thin layer of dust. The desert looked normal again, harmless under the pale morning light. But when I walked around to check the area, I saw footprints in the dirt. They weren't boots or shoes, bare feet. Human-shaped, but wrong somehow. The toes were longer, spread farther apart, and the prints were deep, pressed down hard like whoever made them was carrying weight. There were a lot of them, circling the tent and leading off toward the cliffs. I packed everything up as fast as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. I threw my tent in the truck, still half collapsed, and got the hell out of there. The road back felt longer than it had the day before. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking along the road behind me. The farther I got, the less that strange feeling faded. By the time I reached the main highway, I convinced myself it was just a weird encounter with some local or maybe a drifter living rough out there. But about a week later, when I got home and started going through my camera's SD card, I found something that made me freeze. I had taken pictures at sunset the night before that night, wide shots of the cliffs, the campfire, and the horizon. In one of them, barely visible at the edge of the frame, there was something standing on top of a boulder behind my tent. It was tall, thin, with its arms hanging low. Its head looked wrong, almost too small for its body. I hadn't seen it when I took the picture. I deleted the photo. I didn't even finish the project. I haven't been camping alone since. Whenever I drive through Arizona now, I stay on the main roads. I don't stop near the mesas. I don't pull off onto dirt paths, no matter how empty or beautiful they look. Sometimes at night, I still think about those footprints, how deep they were, how far they circled the tent, how they led off toward the cliffs and didn't come back. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just some drifter or wild animal. It knew I was alone. It knew where I was sleeping, and it waited close enough to touch the tent, to listen to me breathing inside. That's the part that still gets me. It never tried to hurt me. It just watched.